Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural RSA Journal Club. I'm really grateful to all of you for being here and to our presenters today and our moderators. This is an innovation that I think is going to be quite popular. We all remember Journal Club from our training days, and maybe we still run Journal Clubs for our residency programs. They can be very important because they allow us to really do a deep dive into important landmark articles. And I think that in the new normal of the COVID web presence, it's opened up an opportunity for us to do this kind of interaction with each other and to really further the kind of collaboration that we have with the RSA. What makes this series so special is that the articles will not only be discussed, but they'll actually be presented by the authors and moderated by top experts. We have, if you look at any journal in refractive surgery, the vast majority of articles are written by RSA members. So why not come together and talk about them as colleagues? The fact that we have so many wonderful, smart innovators in our society makes this possible. This webinar today is entitled Corneal Approaches to Presbyopia. And it will present two views, two important articles about multifocal or varifocal corneal correction. The program features articles by RSA members as lead authors, Dan Reinstein and Sufi Taneri, two thought leaders, really wonderful, inspirational thought leaders in the field. Dan will present his paper on Presbyon with the Zeiss laser, and Sufi will talk about his clinical study on SupraCor with the VNL platform. Moderators today include Michael Mrochen and Damien Gatinel. Michael is a PhD that's been very involved in development of many of our platforms and devices over the years from an engineering point of view and validation point of view, wavelight laser and a whole line of things beyond that, all the way through to his current work with Alitex and other things. Damien Gatinel, of course, is an MD, PhD. I like to say that because he has two PhDs. He's really done an incredible job with his mathematical analysis of wavefronts and recent publications, and it's changing how we analyze and consider corneal optics in a way that, and ophthalmic optics in a way that's going to open up new frontiers on how we can interact with correcting vision. So with no further ado, let me turn this over to Damien Gatinel. And Damien, thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to this great session.
Hi, Guy. It's a nice it's a pleasure and an honor to be here tonight among my colleagues, my friends, and welcome everyone. So I think it's a very timely question that we may raise about what's working in presbyopia, what's the new thing, and what can we do to improve the treatment, to better understand the basics. And I think for those things, it was very, very mandatory that we would welcome two experts in the field, Dan Reinstein, who I'm sure you all know, who has published one of the first, I would say, like a landmark paper about corneal presbyopic modern corrections about 8 years ago. And this paper has been followed by others, and one of the last of these following papers was delivered lately by my friend Sufi Taneri from Germany, who is also known for his kind of, and I'm French, Cartesian way of thinking, and he did like a comparative study, which will be very interesting to discuss also along with that of Dan about varifocal versus monofocal LASIK. And before they would speak, I think it would be maybe also very important that Michael would probably set what presbyopia represents on the market for us ophthalmic surgeons and refractive surgeons who just are at a kind of maybe corner turning point in our practice due to this pandemic thing. So Michael, do you want to say something about that?
Thank you very much, Damien. I would like to welcome you also. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And I think presbyopia, as we all know, is kind of still a holy grail in refractive surgery and refractive corrections. And I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. However, so far, it's a kind of an untapped market. So, you know, laser vision correction hasn't really penetrated into this area. And I think the purpose of this session and the reason why we choose corneal-based presbyopic correction is discussing, on one hand, the science available, the clinical outcomes, the methodologies out there, but also maybe take it into the perspective of the opportunity being associated with the presbyopia correction on the cornea. Again, let's start with Dan Reinstein. As we all know, is a highly accomplished person. Then I also go back for quite a lot of years, and it's always fun to listen to him. And be sure we're going to also challenge you in the discussion section at the end of the presentation. Dan, please.
So I've been asked to present this paper, which, as Damien mentioned, we published about 8 years ago. But I want to just put a little background to it, because obviously the paper itself doesn't speak the whole story, and I have 10 minutes. So obviously my financial disclosure is that I am a consultant for Carl Zeiss, and actually all the work that I did between 2004 and 2006 to develop this concept was transferred to Carl Zeiss. I have no financial interest in Presbyon itself, other than the fact that it comprises more than half of my practice. I want to, start by one of the things that I think one of the wrong paths that we've taken in ophthalmology over the last 20 years in presbyopia correction. The world has been divided by, I would say by the manufacturing component of the industry, into two worlds. They've talked about cornea correction and lens correction. And I truly believe that this idea that these are two separate planets is really it's not a good way of thinking of presbyopia correction. I think the way we need to think of presbyopia correction is 3 planets. What I mean by that is multifocality, spherical aberration induced increased depth of field, EDoF, and monovision. Those are actually the 3 planets. And actually, these 3 planets occur in 2 parallel universes. And in each of those parallel universes, all 3 modalities can be applied to the cornea or to the lens. And Sufi is going to present a paper using, for example, multifocality in the cornea. Most people, when they think of lens, they think of multifocality, but EDoF has finally reached the vocabulary of cataract surgeons. And monovision was always around. It was around since contact lens monovision started. So it's a very old technique in lens. But I believe that in terms of static solutions to overcome the loss of a dynamic process called presbyopia, called accommodation, the static solutions are all converging on the same solution. And we're moving away from multifocality, away from monovision, and towards the use of spherical aberration to increase the depth of field and a small anisometropia to cover the distance from near to intermediate to distance. So that's my perspective of where I'm coming from in presbyopia 2020, let's say. And we know that monovision has, 5 main areas of challenge. And I don't have to belabor these because you all know what they are. And one of the most important ones, though, is loss of stereoacuity. And that's very important, for example, for eye surgeons. So eye surgeons wouldn't really choose a monovision treatment because they don't want their stereoacuity to break. We know that the relationship in the brain between summation, subtraction, and then suppression is the curve that we need to keep in mind when we're making an anisometropia. We know that with no anisometropia, with both eyes together, we see 140%. Even though one eye is 100% and one eye is 100%, we know that there's neural subtraction once you get past about 1.3 diopters of anisometropia. And we know that in those who can achieve it, there is actually suppression to 0 vision in one eye, and therefore just 100% in the other when you get to a full 3.5 diopters of anisometropia. I described in 2004 in a paper in JRS the spherical aberration filtering of the brain and tolerance levels, which came from working on night vision repair. So I wasn't thinking about presbyopia at all. But once I realized that, and then I started to apply it to try and decrease the anisometropia required in monovision. You know, years later, this was 2004, we published our paper. This is 2009, you see a paper using adaptive optics showing that you can increase positive or negative spherical aberration and increase the depth of field of the eye. But once you get past a certain point, then that spherical aberration no longer becomes therapeutic level and it becomes a toxic level. So we lose the benefits once we go higher. And those are the limits that I had discovered by trial and error early on, usually by repairing night vision disturbances and realizing how much spherical aberration can still be filtered with good contrast and no night vision problems. And so this brought us to the concept of using, instead of a plain defocus, a defocus with spherical aberration, so that the non-dominant eye set to -150 is seeing better than if it was just -150. The spherical aberration adds edge detection capabilities through the brain function. Now, the brain function means that the spherically aberrated -150 image actually in the brain is much better because of the filtering. And so the dominant eye, which has a bit of spherical aberration and is filtered, leads us to have the brain having to combine these two images between the eyes, as opposed to monovision, where you have a defocus of -150, let's say, but usually more, and having to combine that with this image. So this depth of field has given us the ability to decrease the anisometropia of the image in the mind, even though nominally the refraction is still the same. Now, actually, the first paper we published on this was, as you can see, in 2008. So, you know, we moved on to, that was hyperopia, then myopia, and finally the emmetropic paper, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. But as you've seen this, many of you have seen this slide before, this procedure gets you visual outcomes that are really second to none in terms of accuracy. And because it's LASIK, and LASIK is very accurate. So we're relying on a super accurate procedure to deliver you know, these visual results, which you cannot achieve that with intraocular lens calculations. The lenses don't even come in divisions that would allow this sort of accuracy. So on to this paper, which, you know, shouldn't take long to explain now that I've gone through this. So this paper had 71 emmetropic patients, and we set the dominant eye for plano, the non-dominant eye technically for -150, which is the depth of field between 0.75 and -225, and we're presenting the results at 1 year. So you see, ideally, we would like to have controls for our, because obviously when you can beat a patient into seeing better post-op than pre-op, particularly if you're not taking their lens out, they might make more effort for you. But that's not possible. So all we have here is the ability to do a case study and maybe compare it to controls. So you can see here that the attempted refraction for the distance eye was in the emmetropic range. And obviously for the near eye, the non-dominant eye, it was basically a hyperopic ablation. And you can see that the accuracy is extremely high. We have 89% of these patients are ending up within a half diopter of intended. And now let's look at what they're seeing. So pre-op best spectacle corrected vision, well, the inclusion criteria was minimum 20/20. So that's why that's 100%. But uncorrected, we had 80% seeing 20/20 binocularly, but monocularly, 56% of the eyes were seeing 20/20. That's pre-op. Now let's go to post-op. So binocularly, post-op, we had 97% of these patients seeing 20/20 binocular. The distance eyes alone, 95%, slightly less because we're not having the summation occurring here, and that's showing you about stereo, and I'm going to talk about stereo in a second. And then the near eye, the distance vision of the near eye was in in almost 90% was 20/60. And that's what I was talking about. This very, very good distance vision of the eye that's doing more of the near vision. Now, the near vision, obviously, with correction, with distance correction in binocularly and monocularly before surgery, and this is the binocular vision post-op. So you can see basically J2 in 90%, 95% of the eyes, and J3 in 100%. These are technically perfect results when you compare them to the alternatives of using intraocular surgery, for example, to achieve the same thing. The near eyes, of course, seeing better than but still, there's still near vision in the distance eyes. And when we look at the visions combined, you can see that the vast majority of patients end up in the J3 20/20 box. A couple of outliers, yep, slightly overcorrected in the distance eye, but of course, as you know, this is just LASIK, so all you have to do is a little tweak and you can get those guys into the box. Very easy to do. The distance corrected near vision was increased in over 50% of the eyes. It was decreased in 30%, but this is not an exact science, it's biology. So some eyes don't get that increase in depth of field. But the point is, the distance corrected near vision was increased in general, and there was no loss of lines, and no loss of two lines. There's loss of one line, but there's no loss of two lines. And this is what I think is most important about using spherical aberration rather than multifocality. The stability was as you would expect for LASIK. The cylinder correction was as you would expect for LASIK. But the contrast is not as you would expect for the reputation of corneal refractive surgery for presbyopia. The reputation is you're going to lose contrast, but of course we don't lose contrast here. And as far as stereoacuity, knowing that more than 150 causes a breakage in stereo that doesn't get repaired even if you take the monovision off, we did the study for safety, and there were a bunch of patients that we isolated for stereoacuity study, and we did their near corrected, best pre-op and post-op, binocular, near, best corrected stereo, but we also measured their post-op uncorrected. Because the question was then, how much of contribution up near are you getting from the distance eye? And as you can see, essentially within the limits of repeatability, there was no loss of stereoacuity from pre to post, but we still had efficacy on stereo despite the monovision, or let's say the anisometropia. I don't like calling it monovision. I want to call it binocular vision. So we had 85% of the eyes seeing 200 seconds of stereo. Remember, you only need 800 seconds of stereo to thread a needle. So these patients have stereo despite the fact that the eyes are slightly different. And then finally, there's the adaptation time. And in our Plano presbyopia paper, we did the adaptation study because they're the patients who take the longest to adapt. So this is the worst case scenario. And what we found was that, well, at 3 months, we had 75% of the patients adapted and 25 not. But by 1 year, 94% were adapted. And who wasn't adapted? Well, 5 out of the 148 patients. And you know what? That 5 then got dealt with either by a small adjustment to slightly compromise the near, but give them more comfort for cross blur, or the patient, having had a contact lens put in and realized that they were going to lose some near, just said, you know what, no problem, I'll just wear driving glasses at night. And we have about 5% of patients who wear driving glasses at night to drive generally. So in summary, this is it's an aspheric profile that behaves differently depending on the different pre-op parameters. But essentially, we're able to correct pure presbyopia simultaneously with the minuscule refractive errors that might be in there. It's easily enhanced any time down the road because it's just LASIK. We're centering everything on the visual axis accurately with an eye tracker. There's minimal compromise to night vision. Contrast sensitivity is preserved. It's tolerated by essentially, in our studies, 97% of the patients who walk through the door. We maintain functional, uncorrected stereoacuity, and it's performed as a bilateral 10-minute procedure that heals in 3 hours. So For us, this is the dominant force, or has been a dominant force for our practice in presbyopia correction the last 16 years, and it comprises more than 50% of our work. That's this paper, so we can discuss it.
Thank you, Dan, for keeping on time first and giving us a quite clear overview of your, I think, results. And we will discuss more maybe about the method later on. But before we do so, I think now it's time for Dr. Taneri to present his paper and his collaborative work in Germany at the Heidelberg University about varifocal presbyopic correction and how it compares with monofocal LASIK in presbyopic hyperopic eyes. Please, Sophie.
Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Michael. And I would like to especially thank Guy for having this neat idea of founding a journal club, which we will all be able to learn a lot from, I think. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Obviously, it's a mission impossible to talk about, to talk after Dan, but I will try. So we approached varifocal or presbyopic LASIK from a different angle. We come to different conclusions, but they are not contradictory at all. So I can underwrite and emphasize everything that Dan has said. What our study is about isolating the effect of the ablation pattern itself. So varifocal versus monofocal LASIK. And so as Dan mentioned already, accommodation is a moving target, and any static solution can only be a compromise. This is also true for the progressive glasses, which are very popular here in Germany. And it is very difficult to look for any presbyopic surgical solution here in Germany, because, and Michael will confirm that, the progressive glasses industry is extremely strong here. So we don't like having patients myopic after LASIK, because then they would be legally bound to wear glasses during driving. Let me talk about some terminology first, because varifocal is a term that may not be familiar to some of you. Here you see the normal presbyopic eye, which can only see clear in the distance. And this is a standard bifocal optics, like bifocal contact lenses or bifocal intraocular lenses. And this is what the company, this is a company slide, claims, sorry about that, what the company claims that varifocal optics should be like. So it's similar to EDoF, it's a continuous focality instead of having distinct multifocal points. So that's the company claim, and other companies also pursue the attempt of presbyopia correction with LASIK. And mainly we have four components. We have the induction of spherical aberrations. This may be called varifocality or multifocality. These terms are sometimes used very imprecise, and maybe Dan or Michael or Damien can allude about the terminology later on. And a myopic target is also recommended or employed by most of the manufacturers. And by the way, I am a consultant to Bausch & Lomb and to Carl Zeiss Meditech, but not to Schwind, which may or may not be perceived as a bias. So monovision or anisometropia as a target was mentioned by Dan already. So a different myopic target is what is recommended nowadays by many companies. And optical zone size plays also a role. I cannot go into this in detail, but just to show you what is behind SupraCor or the varifocal concept. Here you have a cornea, and the more prolate the cornea gets, the more minus the Q value gets, the better for presbyopia correction in theory. So a central prolate cornea may be beneficial for presbyopia correction. That's the idea, the concept behind SupraCor. And how are they going to implement this? This is again a company slide. A small bump in the center is practically the near addition zone. Then we have an intermediate and distant zone in the periphery. That's the concept of SupraCor. And our purpose with our little study was to isolate the influence of the ablation pattern. We wanted to dissect what the ablation pattern does, because I am not the brain behind the SupraCor algorithm. So I wanted to reverse engineer what we get from the company. So how did we do that? We designed a prospective and comparative trial. So we directly compared varifocal versus monofocal ablations on the same laser using the same diagnostics and the same examiners. We also targeted emmetropia in all eyes. This is not what the company recommends. The company recommends to target -0.5 in one eye and -0.1 or 1.5 in the other eye. So different anisometropic myopia. And all our patients were similar, namely hyperopic presbyopic. So these are the baseline demographics. These are old data, I think 8 years ago. So I was the first to use SupraCor in Germany, and with the nomogram at that time, we had a slight overcorrection. So that should be beneficial for the near vision and intermediate vision compared to monofocal LASIK, which we had used for several years before. So if you can't read these small prints, then you should go and get some LASIK by Dan. I will summarize those in a second. These are the refractive outcomes at 3 months, and these are the longitudinal visual acuity outcomes, and down below is the contrast sensitivity measured with the Sloan chart. In summary, to make it short, in hyperopic presbyopic patients with emmetropia as target refraction, varifocal LASIK improved far, intermediate, and near vision. So no doubt about that. But so did monofocal LASIK. Monofocal, non-aspheric LASIK did the same and to the same extent. So varifocal was not superior to monofocal ablation when using emmetropia as a target. So this is counterintuitive. How may we explain that? Remember the central bump. I was skeptical from the beginning because this may be masked by the epithelium. right? And then was the epithelium expert even then, but we didn't have a epithelial thickness map at that time. So, however, knowing that the epithelium is able to mask traumatic or other inflammatory processes like that to yield a stromal contour that is smooth, we may appreciate the epithelial masking. So this is a SupraCor patient 4 years out. And in the pentacam, we see a central bump. And we think, well, that's obviously the SupraCor effect. Yes, it is. But also a hyperopic LASIK causes some central steepening. And looking at the epithelium map, we can see there's a clear masking of the epithelium. There's a clear thinning in the center which completely masks this central bump. So this epithelial masking may compromise multi or varifocality and a smoother transition zone, which is not only a smoother bump, a smoother transition, and a bump that is not only 2 millimeters in width may be beneficial, and that's exactly what is pursued by Dan. So in conclusion, with emmetropia as target refraction, varifocal ablations yielded no additional benefit compared to monofocal ablations in hyperopic presbyopic patients. So again, the epithelium may be masking the central bump in varifocal ablations, and a myopic postoperative refraction or modified monovision or blended vision with anisometropia between eyes may be necessary to further improve near and intermediate vision. And in more general terms, these results demonstrate the value of a controlled study, especially when evaluating presbyopia corrections, because it's difficult enough to measure distance visual acuity, but it's even more difficult to have a multi-center study comparing different presbyopia corrections, because these were not even standardized until recently. So this is very difficult in a different setting to compare. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much, Sophie. You made the point, I think. And so we have a lot of things to discuss. I think, given all the information we received in the last 20 minutes, I would say general remarks that, for example, I think we've heard about the difference between multifocality, EDoF, and monovision. And I think maybe we could build on this, because for people who attend this kind of lecture, of course, they may sense the difference between monovision and multifocal procedures, in which I put EDoF to make it simple. But between EDoF and multifocal procedures, there's maybe a little difficulty to draw a line. And in this kind of mechanism, we've learned also that spherical aberration play a key role. But still, we don't know whether if it's positive or negative. We understand it's negative probably in Sophie's work. But in Dan, we would like to get maybe more information about that. And I think, again, all these techniques are variation around monovision, if we want to be a bit provocative. But they build on monovision. The similarity between what, at least if there's a common point in all the myopic, all the presbyopic strategies, I think, is that there is still a difference between the dominant and the non-dominant eye, right? Correct? I'm not aware of any laser method which states that they do exactly the same treatment on the dominant and a non-dominant. And just for this reason, there's like a link to monovision, of course. But where it differs from it, that's where we can start to discuss now. As Dan said, Dan, I would like to have your comment about how would you really distinguish between what's called multifocality and EDoF, which is varifocality. I understand, although that it's very difficult to create a very abrupt, or I would say distinct multifocal thing like you can do with a diffractive IOL. But still, how would you not say a cornea is multifocal, but vari or EDoF? Like,
yeah. No, I think, you know, I'm going to suggest, Sufi, I'm going to suggest that the way that you're talking about it is the way that some talk about it, but I'm going to suggest that we maybe can come to an agreement that that's not the best way. Because the term multifocality, it can be thought of as continuous change in focus. It can be thought of as 2 foci or 3 foci or 4 foci, multiple foci, multifocality. And what I think needs to be understood about spherical aberration EDoF is that is not varifocal and it's not multifocal.
by what then? That's
because, as I was showing, the difference is to do with the way that the brain processes spherical aberration. It is very specific to spherical aberration. In other words,
I'm sorry to interrupt. So you mean that there's no spherical aberration in Sufi's strategy? I mean,
no, of course there is. And that's part of the reason why he saw the same effect in the other eyes. See, let me get to that though. You see, if we take the terminology a little bit to the etymology of the word, multiple foci, multifocality. So that's where I've come from for the last 15 years. I've said, no, if you're going to talk about multifocality, you're going to be talking about giving a patient intraocular rivalry, which has to be sorted by the brain. Monovision is interocular rivalry, which has to be sorted by the brain. And EDoF is different. Although we are using some anisometropia, so you're right, Damien, there is a anisometropic component to it, but I don't want to use the word monovision anymore because, as I've shown, it's not one eye. Mono is one. It's not one eye for distance and one eye for near, because as I showed, the distance eye is seeing enough near to give you 200 seconds of stereo. So,
yes. So now let's talk about spherical aberration a bit more. So
yeah.
Are you doing or is Zeiss doing the same amount of the same sign or different amount of the same sign or opposite sign in between the dominant and non-dominant
Zeiss
eyes?
is not doing anything. I did this and Zeiss programmed it. I want to be very clear about that. So, because this can be done by anybody. It doesn't have to be just Presbyon software. If you understand the principles of this, you can do this at home.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a proprietary secret formula. I've published it, I've talked about it, I didn't patent anything. It's just facts, okay? So the point here is that...
Make it simple. I have the Alcon laser. How would I do
what you wouldn't... Okay, I'll tell you what you wouldn't do with the Alcon laser, which is what you've been told to do. And that is to set the Q to -0.6 target final. That is what you would not do. Because if you do that, it'll only work in hyperopic cases.
Good. So that's a good point.
If you do it in myopic cases, what'll happen is you're going to create central islands.
Yeah.
And we
so
know from Sufi's work, one of the things that Sufi didn't show was in his paper was the massive difference in safety that you can achieve you look at the other, yours was a small study, but look at the more recent study that was published, where they did one eye with just plain profile and the other with SupraCor. And the loss of lines was I think 5 or 10 times higher with the SupraCor eye. There's a loss of contrast if you do multifocality in the cornea. So the principle, the way that anybody can do this with any laser is the principle of how this works. If I can show you a slide on that, it would probably be quicker to explain and easier for everyone to follow this. But the software works like this. I've already discussed the fact that there's a threshold after which that amount of spherical aberration becomes toxic. So let's say the average person who walks in who's presbyopic, they have a little bit of positive spherical aberration in their eye. Now, if you're going to make let's say a -8 myopic correction, you're going to increase that positive spherical aberration. Now that might have gone over the threshold. And so what we've done is we've worked out based on the pre-op spherical aberration, the corneal curvature, the amount of spherical aberration we think we're going to induce by this particular ablation. And different characteristics, patient age, how much they can accommodate at this point or not. We've worked out how to limit the amount of spherical aberration, but not reduce it too much.
Dan, do you need to do topography and wavefront acquisition before the surgery then?
Wavefront, the wavefront. The wavefront of the whole eye. You want to know what the pre-op spherical aberration is. It's part of the equation. Now, if you have a hyperopic eye, that comes in like that, but it's hyperopic. Obviously, you're driving the spherical aberration in the other direction. And as I showed, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. You get the same effect with depth of field because it's not based on the change in focus of the eye based on pupil size. It's based on the edge detection improvement that the brain can do because spherical aberration is a very specific aberration that the brain of a human can filter. This is the difference. This is why there's 3 categories. And then the plano patients, obviously you're going to push the spherical aberration more positive in one eye and more negative in the other. And that's the paper I just showed you. So some people say to me when I lecture on this, they say, well, I do this anyway. I've been doing that for years. I've always done -150 in one eye and my patients are super happy. And I say, yeah, that's right, you have. But what you're not realizing, because you haven't done a comparison, is that in your monovision cohort, there's going to be patients who really don't have the right amount of spherical aberration, either way too little or way too much. And in the Presbyon formula, you will have much more patients in the right range. And that's all we're doing. So Damien, how would you do it? Well, you will derive the spherical aberration change characteristics of your laser for the zone that you're using, because obviously it depends on zone. And then you will use those graphs to then determine how much more asphericity you have to put into the profile to limit the induction of spherical aberration, or less asphericity to induce more spherical aberration because you want more. So you're going from a conventional profile to a highly aspheric profile.
Yeah, but how much more? How do you titrate the target spherical aberration you think is
right?
The best
okay, so I think the point here is to understand that it's not that the target spherical aberration is not a number; it's a range. So when we looked at spherical aberration control, I don't have these graphs at hand, but the R squared of the intended versus the achieved spherical aberration is like 0.12 or something like that. It's terrible. You cannot predict the spherical aberration of an eye in LASIK. There's too many variables. It's mostly biomechanics. So forget about having to target. I mean, you can do this with IOLs. I mean, the light adjustable IOL, that's what they've done. And Arturo Chayet did a series of 30 eyes. They published it. Fantastic results with super high accuracy in the sphere and cylinder, obviously within a quarter diopter, 95%. But they were also changing the spherical aberration to specific targets. We can't do that in the cornea. What we can do is try to get it in the 0.3 to 0.6 range. Positive if we're treating myopia, negative if we're treating hyperopia.
All right, good. So Sophie or Michael, do you have a question? Because we have also questions from the audience on the right. I think on my screen I see this.
Maybe I may repeat that the idea of putting in a central bump, like the central bump in the crystallines, is not working on the cornea. That's what our study has shown, because this central bump, which was supposed to have an effect on the Q value and the asphericity value, was completely negated by the epithelial masking, as opposed to the central bump in a crystal lens, intraocular lens, where there is no epithelial masking. And I think this is what was happening and in our patients, and this explains why there is no difference in results. And Dan, you're right, we didn't look for the asphericity and before, and we know that using a non-aspheric monofocal ablation profile, we may have changed the asphericity of the monofocal patients as well, and maybe they benefited the same way as was intended but not achieved with the varifocal lenses, with the varifocal ablations. So there is the same principle that may be applied in an intraocular lens may not be working in the cornea, because the cornea is going to be masked by the epithelium. The epithelium is our friend as refractive surgeons. The epithelium is always on the positive side, but not when it comes to a central bump. Do you agree?
Yes, but what you did specifically, and that's not the manufacturer's recommendation, I think DNL recommends to target myopia. And
Right.
then they anticipate the epithelial effect, because if you target myopia, then you will end up with still a myopic island within the center of the pupil. The epithelium will do the work. It will make the cornea more prolate. More prolate means less myopia toward the periphery. So you bring some hyperopia. And everything I said could be rephrased as you induced spherical aberration, Zernike-wise, negative with myopia in the center. Or in another terminology, you could say I induced myopia, but the cornea is so aspheric that negative sidal spherical aberration makes the periphery less or even metropic. Can I have, because it answers.
But Damien, what you're saying is a very good explanation of varifocality. So I would agree with Sufi that the Eyhance lens, which has this central, very high order spherical aberration in the center, and the SupraCor with the central island, and the intracore and the corneal inlays, they're all producing these central steepening zones, which produce a varifocality within the cornea, depending on pupil size. And let's be very clear that spherical aberration does have an effect in that way, but we found that our results were independent of pupil size. It was purely to do with the specific blur that is produced by spherical aberration. For example, if you do the blur by sphere only, it doesn't work. The brain is not good at filtering sphere, but it's very good at filtering spherical aberration. Michael,
Can I share my screen? I want to show something. Can I share my screen? You can speak while.
Okay.
I have a question to two of you, Sufi, Dan, and it's a very practical question. And as you both know, and I'm disclosing, I'm have an interest in a company called Allotex. We just did the European multi-center trial on presbyopia inlays, and in one particular site we had pentacam measurements, Hartmann-Shack wavefront sensing, as well as placido topography. And one of the practical questions here is what we found is that the pentacam is not able to pick up the anterior corneal front surface changes associated with the spherical aberration induced. So what is your clinical experience? My experience is rating the outcomes based on pentacam is not sufficient of what we're intending here to do, because
Agreed.
the pentacam is not sensitive enough to measure. So
Yes.
it should be either from sensor or on a placido disc measurement.
I agree. At that time, as I said, we didn't have epithelial mapping device, so I couldn't figure out in the orb scan, nor in the pentacam, nor in the Xywave, and also the latest model of the Xywave, if there was a SupraCor or a hyperopic monofocal ablation. And neither could anybody from the company.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So,
Let me show you one slide, guys, because I would like you to see a bit how I look at these things differently from the cornea or wavefront approach. I have the OPD scan, but if you have the eye trace, or I think the TopCon module, you can do the same representation of the power throughout the pupil. In other words, what you see, the numbers here are diopters. And obviously, you see there's a mixture, even in a normal eye, but as you can see, that's an emmetropic eye, for example, that's a pupil here, and the discrete local refraction is evaluated using rotative skiascopy. So here you see that, for example, in a normal eye, you have some, I would call it multifocality in the sense there are like several foci, because it's here you have a slight tenth of diopters of myopia, here a quarter of diopters. That's of course not enough to induce sufficient depth of field so you can read. That's a myopic eye. On the other hand, you see, the myopia has astigmatism also there. But again, it's interesting to see that if you look this way to pupil areas, you can see that, and that's why high order aberration play a role, they make the average refraction varying or modulated throughout the pupil. Now this is here in Central Island that I had a long time ago. You see that this patient that was complaining about undercorrection was very happy with his reading, of course, because when he was reading, the pupil would constrict and select the steep cornea area, which was not treated. But on the annulus, which had been treated by the laser, emmetropia was achieved, and that's typically a multifocal eye. But of course, there's a progressive gradient of refraction. There's no abrupt jump from -2 to half a diopter. There's like a blend there. So this is a SupraCor that I measured in the patient. And this was almost myopia everywhere. But again, you see when the pupil was at least dilated, there was still, and all these eyes, I think he would be negatively aberrated in terms of spherical aberration. That's the FCAT, Q aspheric prolate cornea. And that's a SupraCor. I'm sorry, I don't have a PresbyMax or a laser blended vision case, but I suspect that when you refer to negative spherical aberration, all these techniques, they can be described as you induce myopia somewhere in the pupil and presumably in the center, which is making something good for the at least accommodation reflex, because you will, when you read, have this meiosis and near kind of movement of the pupil, which will select the myopic zone. And again, if you look at this, all what we say at least can be summarized as, okay, blunt monovision is emmetropia everywhere, myopia everywhere here. But all the rest is a variation around the theme that is, I put myopia here, emmetropia there, how much do I do it? That's my recipe, or that's the way I think is the best. But again, it's quite similar. This is not, of course, positive spherical aberration, where you would see the opposite pattern of a emmetropic zone here and probably myopic zone there. Now, Dan says that the pupil doesn't work, doesn't play a big role in the vision. In my experience, it's maybe not as big as we could feel, but anticipate, but still, I think that I would say that for the non-dominant eye, strategies where myopia is in the center work better. For the dominant eye, where distance vision is critical, strategies where the center of the pupil is emmetropic when the periphery is more myopic are probably better, at least for hyperopes and emmetropes. For the myopes, I'm glad Dan does multifocal surgeries. I'm just coping with monovision with them. But at least for the hyperopes, you see, if you use versions map, and I would urge people who publish on those strategies that they refer versions map because they speak to me more clearly and physiologically than cornea, spherical aberration, Q value, which is an indirect way to describe what we do that is true multifocality in some ways, or varifocality or whatever, and strategies that you can segregate into big category: myopia in the center, emmetropia in the periphery, or
yeah.
And that's
But this is where again, I think we're mixing things, and that's again making it confusing. I think that Damien, here's the thing: all of these examples that you're showing have what I would call multifocality, because it's one focal area here and another focal area there. Okay,
right.
And the disadvantage of this is that the safety is poor. And that's been shown in study after study after study after study. If you're perfectly centered.
What would we see if we had a map like this with a presbyon in a hyperope, let's say?
You would not be able to tell the difference between a presbyopic or a simple LASIK procedure. Ever. Never. Because all we're doing is controlling the spherical aberration. We're not trying to get more power in the center. By definition, in a myopic presbyon, and myopic presbyon works extremely well, and there's no loss of lines and no loss of contrast, but we don't have more power in the center.
So where do you have the more power then? Because you need more power.
We have more power. Look, we have positive spherical aberration. So if we're going down the road of thinking the way you're thinking, presbyon wouldn't work. But it does work. So you need to think maybe the way I'm thinking doesn't apply to presbyon.
Oh, the way I'm thinking is simple to me, and I think we can debate on that, but if you if you want to have a patient reading without spectacles, some part of his pupil or her pupil must be conjugated with near object and retina. That is, some part of the pupil must have refraction. They must have a myopic refraction.
Hold on. I disagree. I disagree with that statement. Okay, as crazy as it sounds.
If you want to form an image on your retina, you need. If you want, of course you need.
This is not about the retinal image. It's about the mind image.
No, come on, Dan. You cannot bypass the eye. Then
I will show you. I will show you right now. I'm going to show you on the internet what I mean. Okay.
Dan.
Okay. While you're getting that ready, Dan, I'm going to ask Michael. Michael had a few slides, I think, didn't you, Michael, that you wanted to show as well?
No, I don't have slides. I think the conversation is kind of a hypothetical discussion here about the amount of spherical aberration are not induced. Dan, I haven't seen anything in your paper where the pre and post of waveform measurements showing you modifying spherical aberration.
Yeah.
So it's kind of you leave us in the dark and how much you're modifying the spherical aberration.
Right.
So from that point of view, it's hard to follow your arguments here in terms of you're arguing you're changing spherical aberration, moving a different approach you've figured out, but your paper doesn't reference to that.
No, it doesn't. That's right. I agree it doesn't.
So, and the second thing which kind of goes along is if you follow your concept in maintaining the ability for the brain to keep better contrast, how do you explain that you're not maintaining uncorrected for emmetropic presbyopes? And you do your micro monovision, your blended vision. Why is there a loss in uncorrected distance vision?
Because of the defocus required to cover near to intermediate to distance. I mean, I understand you've asked several questions in that regard, but the first thing that we have to get past is the basic understanding, which we're a little bit behind on here, is the basic understanding of depth of field versus focusing. And I've just searched the internet. I put in depth of field. This is just literally off the internet. Now, in this photograph, this camera is in focus, and this camera is out of focus. In this field, this camera is in focus, and that camera is also in focus.
Mhm.
This is not two foci. It's a depth of field. And we've got to be very, very clear about the distinction. Sufi, I think you kind of confused it a little bit by saying that it's the same, varifocal, multifocal, or depth of field. It's
to the contrary, I said these terms are sometimes imprecisely used.
Imprecisely used. And I want us to be precise. If someone has a bifocal diffractive intraocular lens, and they have a focus at 33 centimeters and another one at 66, both of these cameras will be in focus.
Okay. Then,
but in the middle, it won't be in focus.
Mm-hmm.
And what spherical aberration does is it creates this depth of field.
But then,
let me ask you a heretic question. Just hypothetically, as I said, I don't doubt your results, but just hypothetically, what would happen if you didn't target for minus 1.5 in the near eye?
Right. I'll show you.
How do you think your results would be affected?
Excellent. That's a great question, because that is literally answered here. So if we consider distance, intermediate, near, what we learned was that spherical aberration, I mean, look, Kruger reproduced that with a wavefront, dynamic wavefront sensor, a adaptive wavefront sensor. So what I described was proven experimentally. Depth of field is connected to spherical aberration. Now, what we learned was that you cannot get more than 1.5 diopters of depth of field with just spherical aberration before you start losing contrast and affecting the quality of the vision. That's what we learned in 2004. And therefore, we applied the concept of being obliged to use a micro monovision or a small anisometropia in order to cover the field. So it is quite simply the anisometropia that we have to have is only because we cannot, as Damien said, we cannot have distance and near in the same eye. It's not possible. So we use a small anisometropia, and we're displacing these 150 fields. And what happens is that the distance eye sees in the intermediate as if it was minus 0.75, and the near eye sees at intermediate as if it's minus 0.75, but at near as if it's minus 225. I can demonstrate this right now. So I have blended vision. I was a plano. So if I'm here, which is 1 arm's length from the computer, my vision is almost the same in both eyes, almost the same. If I go to here, I can see the pixels on my screen, but I'm seeing them with my left eye. If I go to here, it's still clear, but this eye is blurry and this eye is clear. Now, if I come closer, at this distance, both eyes are the same.
Yeah,
so I am describing exactly what I showed in the screen here.
Yeah, that's where there's a little like flavor of monovision, but as you say, you make using the depth of focus, you can reduce the difference between eyes. But my
Can I make a request? Can I make you've got it right, but can I make a request?
Stop using the word monovision. Yeah.
Mono in Greek or Latin, whichever it is, means one.
I know.
And we mustn't use that word in this context.
No, but just for the sake of the audience.
No. The audience should also do what we should all try and homogenize.
Let Damien say he's going to say. It's an important point. Damien?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I know monovision is not a good word, but at least everybody knows what we speak about. But
but monovision is a different thing. Monovision is minus 250 in one eye and plano in the other, and you suppress the vision on one side.
Okay. Then somebody called it micro monovision or mini monovision.
I know, and that was I think that was a transition term, which was also not a great term because
blended vision.
Blended
vision is a term that we're advocating. Blended vision.
Yeah. Well, Dan Dury came up with blended vision in CK days. And he called it blended vision in CK. And it was right around that time that I was doing this. And I thought, well, this is blended vision, but it's laser blended vision, not CK blended vision. I think that's an excellent term. But I think that the scientific description of what I'm describing, call it presbyon, I think we should describe it as modified binocular vision.
Okay, let me put
modified monovision.
Another way, Dan. What would the effect be if you targeted both eyes symmetrically at emetropia?
Right.
Whatever you call it. I love the term blended vision as well. That's for sure. But even if you target with one diopter anisometropia, call it blended vision or micro monovision, whatever, what would happen?
Okay, so what would happen is you would get the benefit of the depth of field, but you would only get 0.75 depth benefit because the center of the refraction is here in the middle, and so you only get half of that benefit. So what happened, we're teaching a course. You know that we do a London course twice a year. The RSA talks about it. We're doing our June course actually in June over 5 days, 5 Tuesdays, because we have to divide it out for online. Sufi, to answer your question, there is a case in that course where we demonstrate this. I had a psychiatrist, 56 years old, artist. He did not tolerate any anisometropia, not even 1/4. He was annoyed by it. And he could tell like that. I tried tricking him and no way. He could tell me straight away what was going on. This patient was about plus 125 in both eyes. And his frustration was that when he goes to art galleries, there's nowhere he can see what he wants to see. He can't he can't read the label. He can't look at the painting. One pair of glasses for this, one pair of glasses for that. I said, no problem. I can't give you the near, but I corrected both eyes plano, just as you said. And what he got was newsprint up close. I didn't promise it. I said, you'll need reading glasses. But I said both eyes for near, and he had newsprint up at near, and he had computer vision without any difficulty at all, but he was plano, and he was 56. Now, I'm not the first one to describe that. Alio published a paper about 2008 or 9 or so, where he compared matched controls of people the same age with the same pre-op refraction, but this group was treated with hyperopic PRK, and this group was just corrected with glasses. And the distance corrected near vision was much higher in the group that had the PRK for hyperopia because their spherical aberration was higher.
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing that people are leaving already. We are over time. Maybe in the interest of time, and just to answer some of the questions, we should stop here. Yeah,
I think what I'd like to do is have everyone just make a final comment. We'll start with you, Sufi, go to Dan, Michael, and Damien, and I'll just make a comment at the end, just for final observations that you want people to walk away from this conversation with having in mind.
Yeah, I would emphasize the need for a controlled study especially in presbyopia correction, but also in many other fields.
Thank you. Dan?
I would encourage everyone to read as much as they can and to really get their heads around the definitions that we've been, here we are, super experts all arguing about definitions. And I would encourage people to really understand the difference between those three categories, because once you understand those three categories well, you'll have a much better approach in your practice to what you want to use for patients, and you'll understand the safety much better.
Thank you. I forget where I said Damien. Damien, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, I think what transpires from all these discussions is that companies have their own terminology, they have their own concept that they want to, of course, differentiate, but I believe that we should use a common alphabet, and because we are doctors and scientists, we should, I think, define some metrics and explain maybe more in depth the relation between spherical aberration, what I call vergence map, dioptric variation, which I believe are speaking much for doctors than microns of spherical aberration.
Sure.
Because they actually see it, and try to oblige maybe laser manufacturers to better describe exactly what they do, and if it's in a wavefront change, why not? If it's a dioptric change, why not? But I think the community will be more prone to adopt those multifocal ablation or varifocal ablation or EDoF ablation if they would really understand what's going on. And that would be the first step before we can customize them, because there's more or less some customization sometime, but we don't control that. I like to control what I'm doing, and I think that's the best way to do it. And finally, probably better understand the role of the pupil and see how much we can build on this as well to further optimize, because we had no time to discuss this, but you know, pupil can move concentrically, non-concentrically, can be large in the dark, small, and people who have a very small pupil, they may not need a lot of multifocality. If they have a 1.5, 2 millimeter pupil, well, even a monofocal ablation can work in some ways. So that's what I would urge us to do. Maybe we should do like a task force.
I think we should
really redefine all these things.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I think we should suggest that we write an editorial to define that. I think that would be, I mean, Renato wrote that editorial defining ectasia. I think we should do that. I think it's really necessary, because we're probably a lot of the time talking about the same thing.
Exactly.
But thinking we're not. And then at the same time, we're probably talking about different things, and we think we're talking about the same thing. So I think that would be a great idea.
Along that line, unfortunately, the discussion went a little bit more into the optics part here. But one of the things I realized reviewing both of your papers and being also involved in clinical trials that are supporting towards FDA studies, there's a big gap between clinicians tend to report presbyopia outcomes versus regulators asking the studies to be performed. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very difficult to compare outcomes among those studies. And one of the major differences I found is actually near visual acuity testing. The range of tests used for quantifying the near visual acuity is varying a lot and is far away from what the FDA actually requires. We see issues if we look at those corneal modifications that maybe our diagnostic tools that we consider standard of care might not be sufficient actually to detect precise enough those optical changes. So we need to find standardization on how we're reporting those outcomes. And I think back to your suggestion of bringing a task force, I think if we can come up with something like standards for reporting presbyopia outcomes, with taking all those perspectives will be a fantastic pathway.
I totally agree with you, Michael, but actually this has been published by Alio and Burkhard Dick, and in some kind of task.
and me. If you like, I will put a, I will,
But again, these recommendations are not aligned with FDA and regulatory requirements. This is again a clinician perspective and doesn't help the industry to.
Well, I don't think we should. No. I don't think that we should consider the FDA to be the gold standard. Of
no, we don't, Dan. And as you know, we've worked with the FDA for decades, and we don't consider them to be the gold standard. However, we do lead them. We do lead them. And if there is a peer review article that is put out by a task force, especially with the RSA stamp on it and your names, it will be followed by the FDA. So we have a chance now here to lead the FDA and to cover what they need. They need things as regulators to be able to make equal comparisons from study to study. But I think we do have a wonderful opportunity to do this. And I thank you all for volunteering for that task force. And we will have certainly allow others to participate. But let's get this done, because this is a very important topic. I want to thank everyone for participating today. The panelists, the moderators, 4 dear friends, but also incredible leaders in our field. Thank you for what you've done today. Thank you for the work and the contributions you continue to make to our literature and to our field. We've accomplished a lot today. First of all, we set up a new format for discussing and bringing forward good ideas. I think this has been a success. We will continue the RSA Journal Club. It will go forward. We will do it again, and we'll invite you back, and I appreciate your doing this. Secondly, we've attracted a lot of people who aren't necessarily RSA members. The RSA is a member-based organization. We take no funding from manufacturers. Everyone pays the dues, including me. Everyone does. And it's something that is truly a grassroots effort to grow refractive surgery through collaboration, as we're seeing today. So all of you are welcome to join. Please just go to refractivealliance.com, click the join button. We'd love to have you as members. And third, I think we had an added bonus of identifying a need and forming a preliminary task force, which we'll see come to fruition. And I think this shows the power of our collaboration and being able to lead our field forward. What's different about this generation, and I'm going to just say I've participated in a few generations now of refractive surgeons. What's different about this generation of refractive surgeons is they no longer have to wonder if it's going to work. They're sitting on 30 years of technology development done by brilliant minds, including all of you who are talking to today. And they now have the ability to hold a higher standard. Things like, let's standardize how we look at things and report things. Let's look at the optics of things in ways we couldn't imagine looking at them 20 years ago. Let's quantify shape changes and look at exactly what's happening with these physiological measurements in ways that we could never have done in the past. So we have a different standard today. And I think what we're going to do with this journal club and with these conversations is talk about what that standard needs to be going forward so we can bring our field to the next level. You're all leading it. You've been leading it. You'll continue to lead it. Let's bring the younger people along. Let's mentor them and bring them into these processes. Let's make sure every process we has for every older person, let's bring a younger person in too and mentor them to be part of the leadership and the innovation change that we're doing with the RSA. So thank you all again. We'll be publishing this. It'll be on the RSA website. We really appreciate your being part of it. And really thank you from the bottom of my heart. A great success today. Congratulations.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Dan.
Really great. Thank you, guys.
Great job, everybody.
Well,
great meeting.
We'll set up that paper. We have to write that.
We'll do it.
Yeah. All right.